Welcome to the Lorecast. I'm Dr. Craig Chalkwist, and we're looking at the stories by which we deeply live. We're going to talk today about what to do when you belong to an organization that rejects wise leadership. Makes it hard to be any kind of a leader at all, except a bad one. And so I want to start with an anecdote. Many years ago, I worked as a young technical writer for an insurance company that remarkably is still in business, although as a shadow of its former self. And they wanted to install a new computer system for us to write contracts on. We wrote life insurance and health insurance contracts for large companies. And so we didn't get a chance to test the equipment, but we looked into how it was being used in other companies. And we used a very specialized software for writing our contracts. And so a number of us went to management and said, we have real concerns about being able to do this. And these contracts are under a time deadline, so if for some reason this equipment doesn't work, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. And they waved off our concerns, and you're not tech people, you're not experts. We did test it elsewhere, and they never specified where. So on Monday morning, we all go to work. We all show up in the office, and we try to log in, and none of the software for the contracts works at all. You can imagine what a mess that was. By the end of the week, we were using these old-fashioned word processors that they bought secondhand somewhere as an emergency measure, and we were writing our contracts on those. And our brokers were like, what the hell, man? So the last bit of this little anecdote is that the management person, the management executive who was in charge of the whole computer deal, he oversaw the computers being sold to our insurance company, immediately left. And guess where he went to work? You're right. With the computer company that sold us all the equipment that didn't work in the first place. Yay. So, this is a familiar turn of events for many of us. It shows us a couple of things at work besides corruption. One is that we've all had, I think, at some time the experience of not being listened to by upper management. And what we need to do for this little podcast episode is we need to understand more about why that is and what our guiding stories have to do with all this and how to identify when this is happening as opposed to just ordinary mistakes that we all make, including managers, leaders. And then talk a little bit about what do we do when we're in a situation where this kind of thing is the norm. So one consideration right off the bat that will help us tell the difference between ordinary mistake making and just plain bad leadership in any organizational setting is the consideration that all leaders make mistakes and the good ones acknowledge it and apologize and try to do better next time. The bad leaders don't. They don't do any of that. In fact, when leadership blames somebody else for things going haywire, you should be suspecting that the people in those leadership positions are narcissists, because that is a classic sign of a narcissistic personality. Doesn't always mean they are, but you should at least be wondering about it. And narcissists will destroy organizations if they become leaders. That's a big part of the crisis we're in as a species right now. We don't know much about how to keep narcissists out of power. It's been done at the tribal level. It's been done at the regional level. Occasionally, it's been done in cities. But we haven't figured out how to do that on the national or the international level. And so we're all in jeopardy now. But going back to the organization. So a big indicator that you're in a bad place, that you're in a place that doesn't learn from its mistakes, is when the leaders don't acknowledge their errors and they keep making them and they keep not learning from them. Another sign of narcissism. and they blame everybody else and maybe even you. Classic example of narcissism, as well as a harbinger of eventual organizational failure. An organization in the hands of that kind of leadership has a limited time span. Another indicator that closely parallels the first in many ways is that the leaders don't listen to the people below them in the hierarchy and even make them feel stupid. And along with that, the people who don't raise objections are rewarded. They're promoted over the heads of other people. Now, the guiding story, in other words, the internal narrative that we have about who we are and how we do things, the guiding story in organizations like this is top-down control. That's one name for it. It's been called other things too, like authoritarian leadership and old-style management, old-fashioned management. And the wider context of this is patriarchy. This is the kind of leadership and organizational structure that patriarchy always creates, which is why it's been around for so long. It's been around for so long that some people think it's natural. It's not. There are plenty of examples around the world of doing it differently. And it's built into the structure of our societies, which is another way of saying it's systemic. So some years ago, I got involved in helping to set up a nonprofit. And I noticed that the rules require that there be a president and the board be set up a certain way. And it was all very hierarchical. And you have to do it that way to make it legal. So that's what I mean by built into the system. We wanted to try a more collaborative leadership model, but the laws made that impossible. I've been involved at various levels with numerous nonprofits over the years, and one of the ways nonprofits work around that is that on paper they make somebody the president, and then they just do their own thing anyway. So the guiding image for these old patriarchal structures is the hierarchy. And people can say as much as they want that hierarchies exist in nature. They work differently in nature. So that's the guiding image as part of the guiding story of these old-fashioned organizations. There are other guiding images for more collaborative and participatory organizations, more like a web of connections, for instance, more ecological images. And so an indicator of whether or not you're in an organization that punishes wisdom, and especially wisdom in leadership, is how fiercely it clings to hierarchy. That insurance company I mentioned at the opening, there was this thing they did every Christmas where on Christmas Eve day they would always make us wait to see when we could leave, and it usually ended up being a full work day, so they would generously let us leave an hour early, for instance, when we didn't really have to be in the office. I understand that some jobs require that you work during those hours. Ours wasn't one of them. And so on Christmas Eve day, right before the announcement, or right as the announcement came around, okay, you can all go pretty soon. They had this ritual where all the executives would march downstairs, because of course they were on the floor above us, literally above us, which is usually how it works. And they would line up in a row, and we would line up in a row, and then we would go down the row, and they would condescend to shake our hands, and that was our Christmas present. So in those days, it wasn't pizza. It was shaking a white male executive's hand and then being told, yeah, I guess you can go home now. And of course, this kind of hierarchical thinking is just as rigid today as it ever was. So another indicator that you're working in one of those organizations where wisdom is punished is that wise people don't end up in charge of it. You have the feeling over and over again when you listen to senior leadership that they either live in their own bubble or they just seem like smarmy hustlers who are smooth talkers, eloquent, but they don't really say anything. And that's part of the purpose of business jargon. The right use of jargon is to make communication quicker because, if you've got all these different, for instance, corporate sections, agencies, departments, and so on, if you kept referring to them by their full name, you wouldn't be able to have much of a conversation. It would be really slow. So you might say the folks over in PAR division or whatever. And then, the same with tech. There's all these technical terms that are used that are abbreviations. So that's a usefulness of jargon. But the shadowy side of jargon is that it's intended to convey the impression that a lot is being said when actually nothing is. And so it makes the speaker look informed and effective when in reality they're just pulling the wool over your eyes. So somebody might come along and, during a meeting or a speech, they might say something like, in order for us to align more properly, I want to give you the 30,000-foot view and circle back on what we talked about before if you all have the bandwidth for that. Because we need to close the loop on exactly what exemplifies our deliverables. And, this will be in terms of a full disclosure because what we're wanting to do is disrupt the market in all the right ways. So what I just said is absolutely nothing. It has no meaning whatsoever. And this exists in many different organizations, educational, psychological, religious, you name it. And one of the hallmarks is that even if you're not conscious that that's what's happening, you have this feeling like you missed the boat. And you might look at other people like, did they just get that? Well, they didn't because it doesn't mean anything. So, another indicator of when an organization is not being wisely led, nobody's happy. Everybody complains and nobody's happy. And that's a failure of leadership, always. It's not environmental conditions. It's not, an unlucky run on your revenue and any of that. When a mood of distrust and low morale persists, all the morale committees in the world aren't going to solve it because that's from the top. And it often goes with another indicator of these kinds of organizations, too much secrecy. Way too much secrecy. So there's an ideal among some people, and I'll use a school example this time. There's an ideal among, for instance, some of the graduate students I've worked with think that they should be able to walk into the finances of the school and see everything, numbers, revenue, whatever. And there's a double standard at work here, and also I think a dose of entitlement because if we went to these students, if they were business owners, and we said, open your books, let's see what you did the last year, they would understandably refuse because that's proprietary information. And yet they expect that of the schools they attend. Some students, not everybody. So sure, a school is a business, and when it is a business, there are some business pieces of information that aren't going to be made public. But even so, a lot of schools, a lot of businesses, a lot of organizations err way over on the extreme side of secrecy, which crushes morale, promotes distrust among everybody, and makes people wonder what kind of reality they're working for and living in. There was a school I worked at where there was a lot of executive level conversation about things that affected everybody. Faculty, staff, everybody, students. And I don't know how many times in those meetings I kept saying, just tell people, right? And I'm not talking about, decisions that have to be put together very carefully before they're made public or things like that. Of course you might keep those under the hood for a while so you can talk about them but then you should always go to the people who are affected by them and say, okay, this is what we decided. What do you think? Right? So all of that was left out. All of that was excluded. And so faculty in particular at one of these schools were constantly feeling like they were just getting the rug pulled out from under them because these decisions would be made and without their input, without getting any comments from them, and just imposed on them. So there's the hierarchy again, right? The power hierarchy. So I've given you, I don't know what it is, 4 or 5 examples of how some organizations squash, discourage, reject wise leadership. You could probably think of dozens and dozens more. But let's move now to the question of what do you do about it when you're in an organization like that? And I can tell you what I would do because I have numerous times. And I've been working, by the way, since I was 16 and have been involved, like all of us are, in many other kinds of organizations as well. And you need to know how to operate in a way that serves you and also the organization, if that's possible. So, something that always comes up in this conversation is, should I work from the inside to make change? And the answer is it depends. So sometimes we're in organizations we can't leave. So I had a friend who was in not just a bad organization at work, but an abusive one. And she was 2 years away from retirement. I think it would have been a huge financial loss for her to leave before her retirement kicked in. And now she's really enjoying herself. So, in a situation like that, it might have made sense to try to make things at least a little better before you go. That's what she did. But there are other organizations that you might be a part of where you can leave. And the thing to determine in those situations is the guiding story of this organization, the guiding philosophy, so broken, so patriarchal and hierarchical that there's actually no prospect of it ever improving. Whichever you decide to do, stay or leave, whichever you can do, be sure to also do a couple of other things. You need support, including support from like minded people in that organization, people who have had to put up with the same things you have, notice the same things you have, and can understand it as a direct daily experience. That can be helpful. You definitely don't want gaslighters or people who just think you're nuts because you're brave enough to speak about your concerns when everybody else, or at least a lot of people, are sleepwalking in a deep state of denial. So support is all important. Keeping your sense of humor is important. Keeping some kind of creativity going is important, whether that's in the organizational setting itself or entirely apart from it. Um, the friend I'm thinking of kept her soul alive partly by painting. She joined a group of women who painted, and that kept her going. Another thing to look into is if you're firmly set in the I can make a difference mindset, you need to ask if you're being grandiose. There needs to be some kind of self reflection there. Maybe, do you have a savior complex? Is that what it is? Or stuck to the archetype of the hero, those kinds of things, because that won't serve you. And you might be the person who turns things around there, or you might be the person who organizes a movement to turn things around. That does happen. But then again, you might be kidding yourself. You might be stuck in a savior fantasy in an organization that won't change. So you're going to need to do some exploration internally and externally to see which is the case, whether you actually stand a chance of making a difference or not. Another thing to look into is, why am I here in this organization, really? Is it to learn how to come to voice? Is it to learn how not to try to be satisfied with or settle with these kinds of pathological arrangements? Is it to spur myself to get into a new career? That could use some exploration too. And discard any easy answers that your conscious mind produces. You want to look into that really carefully and deeply. And if you're having nightmares and physical symptoms, then consider the cost to your health and well being, the cost of staying where you are, because those are indicators that it's tearing you down, and those won't stop. They'll get worse. So, something to think about. After putting up with abuse in one workplace, I had a dream that there was a plane crash, and all of the people I worked with were dead in the crash. And so that was my signal: you got to go. So, a last thought: there are organizations out there that are mature and wise and welcome wise leadership. So, just as something to do, just as an exercise, why not look for some of those? They'll make you much happier, and you'll learn a lot. Thank you.